Okay, the Subcommittee of Transportation Infrastructure, Water Resource and Environment will come to order. A couple of housekeeping business first. I ask unanimous consent that Mr. Bashan from Indiana be included in today's hearing. Hearing no objection, so ordered. I ask unanimous consent that the hearing record be kept open for 30 days after this hearing in order to accept written testimony for the hearing record. Is there any objection? Without objection, so ordered. I also ask unanimous consent that written testimony submitted on behalf of the following be included in the hearing's record. Jointly from Representative Shabbat and Fudge, jointly from Representative Latta and Walsh, from Mayor of the City of Akron, Ohio, from the Environmental Protection Agency, jointly from the American Rivers Clean Water Action, NRDC, and the Southern Environmental Law Center. Is there objection? Without objection, so ordered. Today we have one panel. We'll welcome our witnesses in a few minutes, but I will open here with a statement. First of all, I'd like to welcome everyone here to our hearing today for our Integrated Planning and Permitting Framework, an opportunity for the EPA to provide communities with flexibility to make smart investments in water quality. This is a follow-up to hearings we held last Congress on EPA's Integrated Planning Framework. In our previous hearings, we heard about how communities all across the nation are facing increasing regulatory enforcement and financial pressures, not only to address sewer overflows and other aging wastewater infrastructure issues, but also to deal with numerous other burdensome regulatory issues that recently have become national priorities. These include more stringent and widespread regulation of stormwater discharges, nutrients and other pollutants, total maximum daily loads, and public drinking water systems, which could lead to many communities having to install and operate at great expense advanced treatment, removal, and prevention technologies. All these initiatives are piling up additional layers of regulatory requirements and economic burdens on our communities, and somehow our communities have to deal with it. A large portion of these regulatory mandates are going unfunded by the federal and state governments, with the result that many municipalities have had to make substantial increases in investments in wastewater and public water infrastructure in recent years. Local communities and ratepayers are now increasingly getting economically tapped out. In response to some of these issues, EPA developed an integrated planning and permitting policy in 2012 that was intended to provide some flexibility in how communities manage their regulatory and enforcement mandates under the Clean Water Act. The policy outlines how communities can prioritize multiple clean water obligations and develop plans for addressing those obligations in a flexible manner and to reduce their cost burdens. At earlier hearings, we heard from witnesses about the implementation of the policy. Concerns that raised included inadequate consideration of strained municipal budgets and affordability, especially in setting compliance timelines. The continued focus on using enforcement mechanisms in the integrated planning process rather than permits, and insufficient regulatory flexibility to adapt to new or changed circumstances. Some of the witnesses also urged the EPA to become more proactive and collaboratively assist communities through technical assistance and pilot demonstration projects to develop flexible, practical, and affordable integrated plans. I am concerned that 2 years have passed since the EPA released the final policy, and little seems to have been done to successfully implement it. I understand that while several local governments are working on integrated plans, no such plans have been approved, and one has been disapproved. EPA has still not done enough to define the roles and responsibility of the EPA, the states, and the communities in implementing the policy, and has not provided clear standards for approval of integrated plans. It appears that some at the EPA, particularly in a number of agency regional offices, still may not be willing to provide flexibility to communities and limit EPA's enforcement efforts, even when the goal is to achieve a more efficient compliance with the Clean Water Act. A continued emphasis on an enforcement approach, including consent decrees and a resistance to considering affordability and innovative approaches to addressing water quality issues, will undermine the flexibility that the EPA ostensibly is trying to seek to provide under this policy. However, there might be some cause for optimism that the EPA is finally starting to become more supportive of implementing the integrated planning policy. I am pleased that back in May, the EPA announced the availability of some federal funding to a few communities for technical assistance in developing municipal integrated plans. This will be an important first step in demonstrating support for and implementing the policy, although EPA still needs to do more. To help with this, I, and jointly ranking with my member Tim Bishop, have written letters to the House Appropriation Committee requesting their support in directing EPA resources towards pilot projects to assist communities in developing integrated plans. There are several legislative proposals under the development that attempt to address various issues and concerns related to the EPA's Integrated Planning Initiative. These proposals include H.R. 2707, the Clean Water Compliance and Ratepayer Affordability Act of 2013, introduced by Congressman Shabbat; H.R. 3862, the Clean Water Affordability Act of 2014, introduced by Congressman Latta; and the draft bill entitled the Water Quality Improvement Act of 2013, being circulated by members of the U.S. Conference of Mayors, including Mayor Berger, who is one of our witnesses today. I would like to hear from today's witnesses about their thoughts on EPA's implementation of the integrated planning policy to date and whether EPA has adequately addressed their concerns. In addition, I would also like to hear from our witnesses about the pending legislative proposals and how specifically the proposals could help address their concerns and any impediments that stand in the way of making an effective initiative for both communities and the regulators. It is time for a national clean water strategy to evolve from a one-size-fits-all mandate and enforcement approach to an integrative strategy that recognizes the individual public health needs and water quality benefits of water and wastewater utilities and resources limitations of communities. Our goal is clean water, and that is best achieved by focusing more on facilitating compliance and less on punitive enforcement mechanisms. Hopefully, this initiative will truly give our communities the flexibility they need to prioritize their water quality requirements and address the huge unfunded costs associated with the growing number of mandates stemming from the EPA water rules and enforcement actions. Lastly, I should mention that we had invited the EPA to participate in this hearing in order to get the agency's perspectives on implementing the policy. Unfortunately, however, the EPA declined to participate due to what the agency said was other commitments. And now you yield to my ranking member, Mr. Bishop, for any remarks you may have.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for holding this morning's hearing. In my view, today's hearing demonstrates the challenges and the frustrations of two intersecting trends in our efforts to improve the overall quality of the nation's waters. As I've noted in the past, there is significant evidence that in the last decade, this nation has stopped making significant progress in improving the overall quality of its waters. For example, if one reviews the last 3 state assessments of water quality, covering the years from 2008 through 2012, the results should be alarming. For rivers and streams, state assessments show a steady decline in water quality, from 50% of assessed rivers and streams not meeting their state water quality standards in 2008 to 52% of these waters not meeting state water quality standards today. Similarly, for lakes and reservoirs, the 2008 state assessments showed that 64% of these waters failed to meet state water quality standards. Today, 68% of assessed lakes and reservoirs fail to meet these standards. Finally, in 2008, state data shows that 45% of assessed coastal shoreline miles failed to meet state water quality standards. Today, a shocking 86% of assessed coastal shoreline miles fail to meet state standards. These trends are also reflected in the Environmental Protection Agency's recent Wadable Streams assessment. For example, in 2006, EPA noted that nationally, 41.9% of the nation's wadable streams were given a poor rating for biological condition, while only 28.2% were given a good assessment. In 2013, EPA's follow-up report noted that 55.3% of the nation's wadable streams have a poor rating, but only 20.7% have a good rating. This information suggests that we are moving in the wrong direction in improving the quality of our nation's water resources. Yet the reality is that any significant additional improvements in water quality will be more complicated, more expensive, and more politically challenging. The second trend highlighted at this morning's hearing focuses back on the Congress and how the federal government has stopped making significant federal investments in improving our nation's water quality. For example, only 4 years ago, Congress appropriated over $6 billion to the Clean Water SRF to finance the cost of necessary wastewater infrastructure, $2.1 billion through the regular appropriations process, and an additional $4 billion through the Recovery Act. Since that time, annual appropriations for the Clean Water SRF have been declining, from an appropriation of $1.5 billion in fiscal 11 to a recommendation of $1 billion in the Chairman's mark of the Interior and Environment Appropriations Bill for fiscal year 2015. Not surprising, as federal investments in water quality improvements decrease, we hear more and more concern about the rise in unfunded federal mandates. To be clear, I do not share the view that the recent actions of EPA or the Corps are the result of overzealous federal agencies. In my view, these agencies are simply doing the job that we, the Congress, told them to do over 40 years ago, to, quote, restore and maintain the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of the nation's waters, close quote. EPA and the state regulatory agencies see the same trend lines in declining water quality that I mentioned earlier and are trying to do something about them. However, in carrying out the job we gave them, they are exposing the difficulties that I also mentioned earlier, that continued improvement in restoring and protecting water quality will be more complicated, more expensive, and more politically challenging. To our witnesses, let me clearly say that I'm sympathetic to all that the states and local communities are compelled to accomplish with limited funding. However, I'm not convinced that our constituents have thrown up the white flag on making further improvements to our nation's water quality. We should not be satisfied that, as some have suggested, our waters are as clean as they can ever be. We must continue to make progress in achieving the goals we established over 4 decades ago, and we, the Congress, must be willing to put resources on the table for states and localities to accomplish this task. Earlier this summer, the President signed into law the Water Resources Reform and Development Act, which includes the first reauthorization of the Clean Water State Revolving Fund ever. This new law will provide additional financial flexibilities to states and to communities to make the cost of building water infrastructure more affordable. Enactment of WRDA was a tremendous first step and one that we should take pride in discussing. However, I think we all agree it is only the first step. Now we must follow through on providing the federal resources necessary to partner with our states and our communities to get this job done. If we remain committed to the goals of fishable and swimmable waters, then we must be willing to commit to providing a portion of the funds to do so. Investing in our water infrastructure network, like so many of the things we do in this committee, is an investment in our nation's future. Let us not shortchange the public, environmental, and economic health of generations to come by failing to meet this commitment. I yield back the balance of my time.
This time I want to yield to Mr. Pashan for a unanimous consent request.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd ask unanimous consent to submit a letter from Lloyd Winnicky, Mayor of the City of Evansville, Indiana, to Chairman Gibbs and to Ranking Member Mr. Bishop.
So ordered. I also ask unanimous consent for Mr. Shabbat to sit in on the committee. Any objection? So ordered. At this time, I will. Other members have testimony they can enter for the record. I'm going to call on Mr. Shabbat, yield to Mr. Shabbat to allow him to introduce one of our witnesses today.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll be very brief. I want to thank you and the committee for holding this very important hearing, and I want to especially thank one of the county commissioners from Hamilton County, Todd Portune, who has held that office for quite a few years, and prior to that he was also a member of Cincinnati City Council, and I was actually a member of both of those fine institutions as well. We're different parties, but this is an issue that we agree on, and that's that we ought to give local communities more flexibility so that they can meet the same high clean water standards that are required now, but do it at a more reasonable cost to the ratepayers and the taxpayers. So I want to commend him for his leadership in this area. He's worked with a whole coalition of other similarly situated elected officials across the country, and this is bipartisan legislation introduced by another Democratic member of Congress, Marcia Fudge from Cleveland, and she's also the head of the Congressional Black Caucus and also a different party than myself, but this is an issue that we agree on, And I want to thank Mr. Bortoon for his leadership in this area and look forward to hearing his testimony today. Thank you.
Thank you. Also today we have Mr. David Berger. He's the mayor of the city of Lima, Ohio. He's representing the U.S. Conference of Mayors and Mayors Water Council. And we also have Mr. Stephen Meyer. He's the Director of Environmental Services for the city of Springfield, Missouri. He's representing the National Association of Clean Water Agencies. And we have Mr. Ron Poltak. Did I say it right? Poltak. Okay, it was close. I'm doing better. Executive Director of the New England Interstate Water Pollution Control Commission, and he's representing the Association of Clean Water Administrators. Welcome all today, and thank you for being here. And we'll turn it over to Mr. Mayor Berger for your testimony, and the floor is yours. Welcome.
Thank you for inviting me to provide an update on integrated planning from the perspective of the U.S. Conference of Mayors. In my written testimony, which is some 40 pages, I cover in detail 4 topics. The challenges local governments face with their water and wastewater systems, the integrated planning dialogue between EPA, the Conference of Mayors, the actual experiences of individual cities, and finally the legislation the Conference of Mayors has developed. I will now concentrate on the experiences of cities, which serves as the basis of our draft Clean Water Improvement Act, which is designed to provide solutions. Local government, not the federal government, is where the job of providing water and wastewater services gets done and is paid for. We are on an unsustainable path, however, when it comes to public water investment and unfunded mandates. We must change, or we will bankrupt communities and permanently impoverish households in those communities. EPA is to be commended for their high level and sustained involvement in this integrated planning dialogue, including Deputy Administrator Bob Perciasepi, Assistant Administrator Cynthia Giles, and Acting Assistant Administrator Nancy Stoner. Their leadership resulted in the issuance of a Green Infrastructure Memorandum and an Integrated Planning Memorandum. The third anticipated product of the dialogue is a memorandum to the regional offices on how they can be more flexible. Unfortunately, local governments trying to address water issues with the regional offices have not been afforded the flexibility discussed with EPA headquarters. While EPA has told us that over a dozen local governments are working on integrated plans, no plan has been approved and one has been disapproved. EPA recently disapproved Evansville's $540 million integrated plan, even though they used EPA's integrated planning framework to integrate SSO, CSO, and flood controls. Their plan uses an adaptive management approach, relies on green infrastructure, and recommends a 28-year implementation period to try to remain affordable. It appears EPA has rejected both Evansville's plan to use green infrastructure and the city's affordability analysis. Akron, Ohio's original plan was estimated to cost $865 million, and the city passed rate increases totaling over 150% to pay for the plan. Late last year, the city advised EPA about escalating costs to implement its plan, which has now risen from $865 million to $1.4 billion. An analysis of the newly estimated costs by income distribution shows that nearly 15% of households within the city would pay over 10% of their annual incomes to implement the plan. My community, Lima, Ohio, has a median household income of $26,900. The impact of rate increases necessary to meet our proposed $100 million plus integrated plan include the fact that some 47% of households in my community would experience rates above 4% of their household incomes. We have seen EPA's integrated planning framework as a very promising initiative that would allow us to protect the environment in an affordable and economically sensible way. Yet more than 2 years after the integrated planning framework was issued, we are still waiting for EPA to say yes to Lima's integrated plan. Cities around the nation are finding that little or no change has occurred in the regional offices in dealing with the challenges of the Clean Water Act. While headquarters prioritizes integrated planning, the regional offices actively resist proposals that require flexibility, longer timetables, and priority settings, and instead focus on high-cost approaches, fixed deadlines, and penalties. While cities applaud the continuing engagement and good faith efforts of EPA headquarters, we must report that the message is not getting through to the regional offices. To fill the gap between EPA assurances and EPA action, the Conference of Mayors developed the Water Quality Improvement Act. Mayors greatly appreciate the interest shown by members of Congress, and we are happy several pieces of legislation have been developed to address them. However, we are concerned that some of the bills will not solve the real-world problems identified by the Conference of Mayors. We are looking for legislation that can benefit all cities through all parts of the country, that does not leave relief for local governments subject to the discretion of the EPA. EPA discretion is what we have now, and we're not seeing EPA use its discretion in ways that recognize that environmental improvements must be affordable. We need Congress to provide relief. We need Congress to provide oversight and to remember the EPA has its authority because of the way the Clean Water Act was written and enacted by the Congress. We need Congress to act. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Portun, the floor is yours. Welcome.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Bishop, members of the subcommittee, thank you for this opportunity to be here today. As you heard from my good friend and congressman, and he is my congressman, the Honorable Steve Chabot. My name is Todd Portun. I serve as Commissioner for Hamilton County, Ohio, and I'm here testifying on behalf of the Perfect Storm Communities Coalition and my home community in favor of H.R. 2707, the Clean Water Compliance and Ratepayer Affordability Act. The coalition that I represent is made up of communities that are dealing with the perfect storm combinations of high unemployment, high home foreclosure rates, stagnant economic growth, and an exodus of business and industry, all while being mandated to meet expensive wet weather consent decrees and stormwater regulations. We very much appreciate the subcommittee holding this hearing and want to thank personally Representative Chabot and fellow Ohioan Representative Marcia Fudge for their leadership in introducing the bill and the bill's 13 bipartisan co-sponsors. Hamilton County and our coalition emphatically support H.R. 2707, the Clean Water Compliance and Ratepayer Affordability Act. And in answer to your question, Mr. Chairman, EPA's integrated planning policy framework and the agency's implementation of it is inadequate to meet the needs of local communities. It has been inadequate to address the concerns expressed by this community, and it has failed the American people who want clean water, but want clean water met in ways that are flexible, affordable, and reasonable, and the current approach is not. The bill, H.R. 2707, does not gut the Clean Water Act nor limit EPA's authorities, but on the contrary, it provides congressional authorization, direction, and guidance in implementing EPA's own integrated planning and permitting framework. H.R. 2707, however, will require the EPA to carry out a program to work cooperatively with up to 15 specifically identified showcase communities each year for 5 years to develop and implement integrated plans to meet their wastewater obligations under the Clean Water Act, and in doing so, to develop a credible body of data that EPA, the Department of Justice, and the Congress can rely upon with respect to a new approach, green infrastructure approaches to the obligations of the Clean Water Act that are more efficient, more effective, and more economical to local communities. By naming specific showcase communities, the EPA would offer a promising opportunity to provide transparency in how it is applying these flexible and new and cost-effective compliance technologies that are being optimized within the framework. The stakes are high, extremely high, for the hundreds of communities across the nation that are working diligently to conform with EPA mandates. Over the last 10 years alone, over $40 billion in mandated wastewater and stormwater upgrades have been required of communities large and small. In fact, 18 of that $40 billion, or 44%, compliance falls on distressed communities, communities that are experiencing some of the worst economic conditions in decades. Hamilton County is one of those communities. Between 2000 and 2012, our poverty rate for individuals in the county ballooned by over 66%. 40% of county households have incomes of less than $35,000 per year, and 1 in 10 in 2012 had annual incomes of less than $10,000 per year. These are the families that are hardest hit by the rate increases that we project, 350% rate increases, in order to meet the obligations of the Clean Water Act under current conditions. And yet, those same families will benefit the most from the savings that will be realized through the flexibility and new technologies that will be allowed through H.R. 27 and the Showcase Communities program. As matters stand today, a green-build approach will result in a $500 million savings for Hamilton County alone, and with the adoption of 2707, that will translate into additional savings for our community and for our residents who are struggling to make ends meet and yet to also afford the rates that are increasing to meet Clean Water Act obligations. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, we believe that H.R. 27 is the best immediate solution to this issue of integrated planning and permitting execution. Other proposed legislative changes will require significant changes to the Clean Water Act or billions of dollars of additional appropriations, neither of which appear to be politically or legislatively feasible at this time. Our communities need relief now. We cannot wait for a better solution to wind its way through the difficult legislative path. But H.R. 27 will provide relief immediately if adopted. Hamilton County, Ohio, and the Perfect Storm Communities Coalition looks forward to continuing to work with you, Chairman Gibbs, Ranking Member Bishop, and members of this subcommittee, as well as working with the EPA in enacting and implementing H.R. 27. I thank you for this opportunity to provide testimony, and am ready, willing, and able to answer any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Meyer, welcome. The floor is yours.
Chairman Gibbs, Representative Bishop, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you. My name is Stephen Meyer. I'm the Director of Environmental Services for the City of Springfield, Missouri. I am also the President of the Association of Missouri Clean Water Agencies, and I serve on the Board of Directors for the National Association of Clean Water Agencies, and that is who I'm testifying on behalf of today. I applaud the subcommittee for holding this important hearing on the issue of clean water affordability and the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency's integrated planning framework for municipal wastewater and stormwater requirements. I am also pleased to testify in support of H.R. 3862, the Clean Water Affordability Act of 2014. NACWA applauds Representative Bob Latta and Tim Waltz for leading the efforts in the House to raise awareness of these affordability concerns and to help craft practical solutions to address them. The Clean Water Affordability Act of 2014 does three critical things. One, it codifies EPA's integrated planning framework and incentivizes its adoption by extending NPDES permit terms for communities with an approved integrated plan. Two, helps small rural communities more affordably finance their clean water obligations by ensuring at least 15% of the state revolving funds are set aside for them. Third, require EPA to revise and broaden its guidance for determining a community's financial capabilities to more accurately reflect a community's financial challenges. I urge every member of this subcommittee to co-sponsor this important legislation. I also thank you, Chairman Gibbs and Representative Bishop, for being part of a bipartisan group of members in the House and Senate who have requested $5 million for this upcoming fiscal year to support an integrated planning pilot program at EPA. And I am pleased that the House has included an appropriation in support of this request in its FY15 spending proposal. Like many others across the nation, the City of Springfield and Greene County region is addressing the challenges of increasingly stringent environmental regulations from every front. From stormwater to wastewater to air quality and drinking water, as regulations continue to evolve, our community is required to devote more money and resources to comply. Currently, the City of Springfield is operating under a 7-year, $50 million amended consent judgment to correct sanitary sewer overflows through investments in inflow and infiltration reduction in our collection systems. After the 7-year period concludes, we will anticipate having to move more investments at the treatment plant and collection system to completely eliminate overflows, which will likely cost hundreds of millions of dollars. We also have a stormwater-related TMDL developed for several of our river segments impaired by bacteria, metals, nutrients, and other pollutants that need to be addressed. While the City of Springfield is currently in attainment under the Clean Air Act, forthcoming Clean Air Act related regulations will likely cause us to go out of attainment quickly. And finally, we have 2 closed landfills listed as Superfund sites requiring remediation under CERCLA. The median household income in Springfield is $42,000. 25% of our citizens' household income is $20,000 or less. Because of our challenges involve multiple federal statutes, we believe an integrated planning approach is really the only practical and affordable way forward to ensure optimization of taxpayer resources. At the heart of Springfield's integrated plan are 6 guiding principles. Affordability. Effectiveness. That assures the biggest bang for their buck. Fairness, to ensure all citizens are being treated fairly and equally. Attainability. To ensure measures can be reasonably accomplished. Measurability. That ensures progress is tracked over time. Adaptability. So that we can adapt and improve based on experiences and results. We know we will have received success when community resources are directed toward managing environmental issues using the most effective solutions to address the most significant problems in a way that is affordable to our citizens. When we are in compliance with all federal and state regulations while addressing the specific needs of our community. When we have the ability to address water, air, and solid waste issues holistically, allowing both our community and the regulators to operate more efficiently. Our community has a high level of trust. When our community has a high level of trust that resources are being used to address environmental issues effectively and efficiently. When our community has a clear understanding of how funding and other resources will be used to improve environmental quality. When our community realizes a competitive advantage toward growth and economic development and increases in quality of life as a consequence of this plan. We have identified specific goals relevant to each environmental resource. In conclusion, Springfield's integrated plan will offer a practical yet effective approach to addressing water, land, and air challenges. NACWA remains optimistic that with Congress's help, EPA can advance this framework to address our mutual concerns. I thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today, and I look forward to addressing any questions you may have of me. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Poltak. Welcome. The floor is yours.
Good morning. Thank you, Chairman Gibbs. Thank you, Mr. Bishop. My name is Ron Poltak. I am the Executive Director of the New England Interstate Water Pollution Control Commission. Been in that position for 32 years. Started my career with Senator Muskie, writing aspects of the Clean Water Act. Been around a long time, but I'm a young, energetic 66-year-old, so I'll try to be as quick as I possibly can be this morning. I am here representing ACWA, the Association of Clean Water Administrators. ACWA has been very active over the course of the inception of the concept of the integrated planning approach. We have been extremely supportive of EPA and the framework and been working earnestly to try and make it happen. Our members agree that when the integrated plan is designed and implemented properly, it will promote innovative solutions that deliver results. We have collaborated with EPA, we've collaborated with our partners here in D.C., and we have brought, as in my case in New England, 3 workshops where states, communities, municipalities of a larger proportion, meaning cities as well as towns, and in addition, the consultant private sector community together to talk about implementing the integrated planning approach, of which there is tremendous interest in respect thereto. Cities in each and every one of our New England states, as well as New York, are vitally interested in moving forward with this concept. During the workshops, what I wanted to share with you this morning is a range of implementation challenges were identified, including the potential increased burden on state resources, consistency in interpretation and application between EPA regional offices and EPA headquarters, the level of detail necessary for plan approval, and how best to handle financial capability issues. The workshops also exposed several statutory and regulatory challenges to implementation that must be overcome for this effort to move forward. Progress has been made, but there still is yet a lot to be done. It is clear that the integrated planning framework anticipates a prominent role for state permitting authorities, and we appreciate the agency's recognition of our role as co-regulators responsible for ensuring that the goals of the Clean Water Act are met. Yet the details of the role are still not clear. The framework makes clear that the state permitting authorities will need to approve the integrated plans developed by municipalities, but it does not provide details on how exactly states should perform this role. EPA has repeatedly stated that it intends to provide practical examples and guidance as it works through the first integrated planning efforts, but ACWA members are still waiting for these details to be fleshed out. The committee can assist the states by encouraging EPA to move more quickly, to develop case studies and practical examples of how integrated planning works, and by sustaining adequate federal funding to support these programs. In addition to the lack of clarity with regard to the responsibilities of state permitting authorities, ACWA members are concerned that while EPA anticipates states taking the primary role in reviewing and approving integrated plans, EPA's authority will linger over the process until the agency makes clear that it will support state decisions. State time and resources are at a premium, and states are concerned that they will invest time and resources in plan review and approval only to have EPA question that decision in the end. States are also concerned that EPA will object to a permit based on an integrated plan that was approved by a state. Finally, the states are concerned that after a plan is developed and implementation is underway, that EPA could come in and order more stringent or different controls or approaches to manage pollution. Certainly, this type of action by the agency would undermine the economic savings envisioned by integrated planning. The role of the states and EPA needs to be clearly defined so that the integrated approach agreed upon by the states and municipalities can be relied on by all stakeholders. We are very much engaged and intentioned to move forward with this process. ACWA encourages EPA to begin exploring the ways that the permits can legally and effectively incorporate integrated plan elements into each and every permit that is employed. The agency could begin developing a set of guidelines or a model permit where the agency is the Clean Water Act permitting authority. The process of developing a model permit would help identify any barriers to implementation and enable the agency and the regulated entities to test out solutions to overcoming the challenges that many of our municipalities as well as the states are faced with. A model permit or case study completed in a state where EPA is the permitting authority could tremendously help the process move along. We need a template, and we're finding that we don't have one. To conclude, I want to emphasize that ACWA's members are supportive of the integrated planning framework, and we appreciate EPA's efforts and receptivity to our comments and concerns. However, many of the concerns I have outlined here today will not be put to rest until there are more real-world case studies and guidance for the states to follow. We encourage EPA to quicken the pace of identifying and conducting case studies to test and evaluate the best way to move forward with developing and implementing integrated plans for all of the communities, for example, that I have in my district of authority who are anxious to move forward but are hesitating. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to thank you all for coming in again and your dedication to enhancing and improving the environment, protect the environment, and also to protect your ratepayers, your customers. And I got to single out Mr. Berger. I just understand that your flight was canceled last night. You got in your car and drove in last night from Lima. That's a good 10-hour drive, so I can understand you might want to take a nap later. First of all, I want to start out kind of the theme here. You know, we're trying to figure out why the EPA came before this committee 2 years ago and put this forth. And it looks like there hasn't been the leadership from Washington, D.C. into the regional offices. And my first part of my question is it because there's a culture within the EPA? I know Mr. Berger talked a little bit about the enforcement and the penalties. And what's been frustrating to me is to see when an entity such as the entities that you all represent are working hard to do what you need to do to comply with the Clean Water Act, and at the same time you're being fined, forced penalties. So do you think that there's been lack of leadership from Washington to the regional offices, or is it just a culture within the whole EPA that we've got a whole cultural problem and they can't, adapt? Anybody want to?
Mr. Chairman, our experience has been, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, members of the committee, our experience has been that there may be cultural aspects connected to it. There are differences between the permitting side and the enforcement side of EPA. Sometimes it just simply comes down to individuals and their experience, what their experience has been. But the bottom line is that there is not consistency in terms of delivering the message that we're receiving out there in the field. So sometimes we're seeing differences between districts or regions, I should say, in the approach. And even within a region, it depends on who shows up as a regulator sometimes in terms of how the approach is going to be. And that's why we believe that there is definitely a need for congressional oversight, definitely a need for new legislation. And that's why H.R. 2707 has embraced within it real transparency and accountability.
Let me ask a kind of a follow-up, and anybody else can address it too, is when you're, like when Lima, you've been working to develop an integrated plan, what's the involvement of the EPA during your development? Are they there working with you, or what's the status of that?
We have been not only developing the plan, but also negotiating a consent decree. And I can say that that has been an entirely frustrating process. And the last time we were at the table in Chicago, folks from headquarters were in the room, and had they not been there, it would not have gone well. It was only the presence and the active engagement of folks from headquarters that actually moved the discussion. Otherwise, the discussion would have been over very quickly. So I would assert that it's, you can use the term culture, but the fact is that the regional offices don't believe in integrated planning. They're actively resisting it, and headquarters has not had the ability to discipline those offices to make certain that things are happening. And I think that the issues of penalties that you raise are a very real part of not just culture, and it's policy. It's policy at DOJ and EPA to penalize cities and other POTWs as a way of enforcing, bludgeoning, getting people, and intimidating folks. It has nothing to do with the shared stewardship responsibility that cities, states, and the agencies have. And that policy needs to change. And I've had direct conversations with folks at the White House. They have said to me they agree, but nothing yet is happening. I mean, that policy of requiring penalties simply extracts money from local communities that have nothing. I mean, we have lots of things to do with those resources, and paying hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars in penalties that go into the U.S. Treasury affects nothing in terms of good public policy in my community or any other community around the country.
Yeah. I also, in Mr. Meyer's testimony, you talk about, I think it was a 4 or 5 point, 4 point, I guess, and examining community priorities, prioritizing those solutions, and then the financial capability. And I like that approach. And then it goes on here in your written testimony. You talk about, you know, we've got find the source of the pollutant that's a major problem, and remediating that, and then move on to the next pollutant. And of course, part of this whole concept of integrating permitting is to give you that flexibility to address your needs, because the needs in Lima, Ohio are probably different than the needs in New York City or Dallas, Texas, or wherever. And then also, so it gives you that flexibility. So I think, you know, legislation is needed here because we're hearing this testimony. But I want to ask Mr. Meyer, when you lay out these phases and do this, what was the role, what are you hearing from the EPA when you're saying you got this plan, we're doing this, we're trying to work with the local community, and then we also take in the financial capabilities of the local community to support this?
Start off with, we were taking a Missouri solution to clean water, find a pollutant, find the source, remediate the source. It's very simple, and it should be very effective. We then move on to the next pollutant. We have formed a Citizens Priorities Task Force, which is currently gathering, and they are helping us to determine what the community's priorities are. The first pollutant may be a water pollutant. The second pollutant may be an air pollutant. We want to be flexible enough that we can move around to different sources. EPA Region 7, Dr. Brooks and Director Pauly of the Missouri Department of Natural Resources, when we developed our proposal, we invited them in and explained what our proposal was. They seemed very supportive. We had a very good discussion. In Missouri, EPA Region 7 has delegated that responsibility for consent decree negotiations for Springfield to the Missouri Department of Natural Resources, as well as the integrated plan development. We have had Missouri Department of Natural Resources in all of our technical committees, as well as a technical resource to the Citizens Committee. They have been very active and very supportive. So far, we have presented to EPA twice to the senior staff. We have kept the headquarters as well as Region 7 up to date. Every time we have a movement forward, we update them. And so far, EPA Region 7 hasn't said stop.
Okay. Just a quick, I'm out of time, but just a quick follow-up. One of the things in integrated permitting is to get longer permit time extensions. I think it's currently 5 years, maybe 10 years or longer. Is there, when you've had any of you had discussions with EPA on that, do you feel real pushback on that, or is that not a non-issue on the permit extensions?
Chairman Gibbs, if I may, Cincinnati, Hamilton County, we are in a consent decree. It's about $4 billion that local ratepayers are paying. And one of the programs that we were required to do within the original consent decree, under the new integrated planning and flexibility, we were allowed to present a green build alternative to that. But here's where the flexibility and the time extension stop. Number one, we didn't have help in terms of working with EPA as a partner on that. We had to design it on our own. So we had what the consent decree required, a gray build solution that cost about twice as much as a green build approach. But we had to come up with a green build approach by a date certain. We had to do all the research and the evaluation behind it. And if we wanted to follow that approach, we weren't given an extension of time in order to meet the requirement of dealing with that one issue. So if our green build solution was not approved, we had to have a gray build solution that was ready to go, or else we faced very, very stiff penalties. Okay. So what we had to do was go forward on parallel tracks and design both. Very expensive, very time-consuming, resources wasted, as opposed to there being a flexible approach. It was still very much an adversarial relationship as opposed to a partnership relationship, which is what we need in local communities in working with EPA.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Bishop.
Could I just add relative to the 5-year permit? Just one quick.
Yeah, go ahead.
The 5-year permits that ensure compliance with water quality standards are a real problem in terms of not being able to extend that time period associated with being able to meet, in a conceptual sense, the requirements that we're trying to address under an integrated planning approach. I mean, it just goes without saying.
Thank you, Mr. Bishop.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the panel, both for your work on this very important issue and for your testimony. I want to stay on this 5-year permit issue, and I understand the concern that water quality solutions obviously could take longer than 5 years, and if you have a 5-year permit, what happens at the end of it? But my understanding is that the EPA has built in extended periods of compliance to 5-year permits. For example, the city of Boise has a permit that memorializes obligations for 10 years after the permit begins. Same with the city of Chicago. For Milwaukee, it's 7 years. So I guess my question is this an example of selective use of discretion on the part of the EPA, such that it's not something that all communities can count on? Or so I guess my fundamental question, Mr. Poltak, is what's the, if the EPA is willing to do it for the communities that I've cited, and I'm sure there are others, why is it that there is not the capacity to do it for other communities?
The way I can answer that is we would expect that to be the case nationwide. Our communities in our region are saying that there is no financial forgiveness in the integrated planning process, and the cities are well aware of that. But in terms of being able to deliver on the mandates that are mounting and the costs that are escalating, we have to have that way of thinking incorporated into all regions through headquarters as a message. It has to be the case to make this work.
So I'm sorry, I want to just put this in my own words. So you're saying that the regional offices, let's say, that have jurisdiction over Boise, they're getting the message from headquarters, but the other regional offices are not? Is that basically what you're saying?
I think what I'm simply saying is that what we're talking about here in terms of added flexibility and extended permit time limits has to become a national policy that's allowed to be negotiated.
Anyone else want to comment on this particular issue? Mr. Berger?
I do think it is based upon individual cities, individual relationships that get built between cities and certain administrators. I think what's also important here is not just the idea of longer permits, but adaptive management approaches, and also building that into approaches that are outside consent decrees, allowing these to be part of the framework of permitting that is allowed and that gives cities the shelter that the agency believes the consent decrees give from citizen lawsuits. These are things that ought to be a part of the framework available to every city. And I want to emphasize that idea of every city in the United States having the opportunities under the Clean Water Act framework, because part of our concern from the Conference of Mayors with the other two bills that are offered around the pilot program is limited to a number of cities, the 15 per year. And with the Clean Water Affordability Act, discretion remains entirely with the agency. We believe that there has to be a real opportunity within the law that limits the EPA's discretion, that in fact gives cities shelter they can rely upon, not relying upon individuals, not relying upon the personalities of regional offices, or even personalities here in headquarters. A big concern I have right now is that Mr. Perciasepi has announced that he's going to be leaving. A concern we have is how much momentum is going to be lost because his leadership is leaving the agency. And how does that signal to those in the regional offices that the pressure's now off and it's back to business as usual?
Thank you. I just have one more question. So, and Mr. Portun, it's for you. You spoke in your testimony quite favorably about using green infrastructure approaches as both a means of addressing a problem and as well as saving money over both the short term and the long term. Can you talk more about that and just what sort of broad-based advantages green infrastructure approaches provide to municipalities?
Yes, Member Bishop, thank you very much. Our experience is that green infrastructure, watershed management, daylighting streams, riparian issues, detention areas to keep rainwater out of sewers, things of that nature, give us an opportunity, number one, to transform neighborhoods, because the green solutions are also the kinds of things that people want in their communities. So not huge gray-build, overbuilt type of things that dominate a neighborhood, but they lend themselves to community beautification and other quality of life issues that are very important. Second, the green build approaches tend to be less expensive, and yet they're more efficient and quicker to put into place. So the benefit that we see there, obviously, is we can get the job done quicker. We can also get the job done cheaper, which is important to our ratepayers. The one issue that I mentioned earlier with respect to the two approaches where we still had to meet the deadline, there was a savings of about $250 million. The gray build approach was almost twice as expensive as the green build approach. So therefore, having the flexibility to implement new technologies, new science, green build approaches, adaptive management, watershed management is very important to local communities for those reasons. I did want to say one other thing, Member and Chairman Gibbs, if I may, with respect to Mayor Berger's comment about H.R. 2707. The 15 showcase communities is not a limitation in terms of flexibility or the full implementation of an integrated planning process. We embrace that fully for all cities. That flexibility has to be built in for all cities, and what that bill does is it requires reporting, accountability, transparency with respect to all that, and congressional oversight so that we have EPA consistently implementing its policy completely. The 15 communities is to build a partnership relationship that becomes cultural within the agency, and to build the data so that the EPA becomes much more comfortable with green build approaches than they are today.
Thank you very much. I'm way over my time, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your indulgence.
No problem. Mr. Crawford.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have just a quick question of all of you. In my district in Arkansas, we're kind of struggling with dealing with a critical habitat designation that will affect about 41% of the state. And so there are, as you can imagine, there are a lot of small cities and towns, a lot of municipalities that are concerned about how that will impact them in obtaining permits. I'm just wondering from each of you if you could comment if you've had any experience with obtaining permits from the EPA because of an endangered species or the potential of an endangered species that resides in a body of water, like, for example, a river that you might utilize for discharge after treatment. Any comments on that? Let's start with Mr. Berger.
No experience in water, but we have dealt with Indiana bat habitat issues and associated concerns like that.
Okay, thank you.
I wish I could help you, but no direct experience with that, Congressman, in Cincinnati-Hamilton County with what we're doing at this point.
Okay.
Congressman, since we're neighbors, we have similar problems. Our DNR is trying to implement ammonia to protect mussels. Missouri is unfortunately mussel-rich, and we have plenty of them. Some of the smaller communities will see increases from $32.75 a month to $354 per month just to address ammonia for mussels. This is a community that has 155 residents, 45 connections. They have absolutely no way to pay for it. The permit was issued.
Thank you.
Representative, we've had a lot of experience in New England associated with that type of issue. It's a long, costly, negotiated process to get to an end point. I'd be glad to put my staff in touch with yours and follow up to any level of detail you might be looking for in that regard.
That'd be great. Any input you could have based on your experience and how you might expedite the process. I know that it can be a problem. Mr. Meyer, you mentioned the mussel. That's primarily the issue that we're having in Arkansas is the Neosho mucket and the rabbit's foot mussel. So we're experiencing a similar problem downstream from you.
In our opinion, mussels are very delicious.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Ms. Napolitano.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman Gibbs and Ranking Member Bishop for holding this very important hearing on the affordability and flexibility within the EPA permits. As a former mayor, and I know how devastating unfunded mandates are to our communities that are trying to do their best and the right thing in addressing the environmental needs of our nation's communities. But also, let's not forget, be aware that more new laws and their unintended consequences could have a problem with you. Cities have been facing budget restrictions and recession has hit them hard. And with more unfunded mandates, this is not necessarily something that we want to go over lightly, but be sure that we do protect our cities. EPA's integrated planning framework is a very good first step towards addressing the financial burden that many cities are facing with meeting their obligations under the Clean Water Act. But much more needs to be done to address the current and growing disparity in the water costs on the poor. And I stress that, the poor. Biggest problem facing my district in Los Angeles County is the expected cost of implementing a new municipal stormwater permit that has increased the amount of, quote, total maximum daily loads, the TMDLs, of pollutants regulated to 33 from the last permit, which was 2 TMDLs. Public Works Department of LA County, 13 million people, say the permit will cost at least $850 million per year to comply. That's million. That means every city with 50,000 residents will have to pay approximately $10 million per year. Mr. Chairman, I ask to submit for the record a letter to you and Ranking Member Bishop from my constituent, Mayor of California's City of Monrovia, Mary Ann Lutz, with an attached report from the U.S. Conference of Mayors regarding financial impact of Clean Water Act permits on just some of the economically vulnerable cities in Los Angeles County. Mayor Lutz. Thank you, sir. Mayor Lutz is the leader in the LA County on water quality issues and helping our cities and the councils of government deal with the new MS4 stormwater permits. She states that it has, quote, "It has become readily apparent that the cost for water and wastewater mandates has grown to an alarming rate and is disproportionately impacting our poorest and our most vulnerable citizens. The problem is EPA established affordability guidelines based on median household income at a maximum of 4.5%, which does not take into account the personal household income. This means that poor people pay far more as a percentage of their income towards their water bill than anybody else. Conference of Mayors report cites examples from communities in LA region that were surveyed, and that's on the record. Every city experiences the greatest financial impact amongst the lower median income household groups, especially those households with annual income below $15,000. Residents of the city of Laverne in my district currently experience regressive financial impacts from public water costs in households earning up to $50,000 in annual income. The poorest households in several cities are spending a significant amount of their actual income over a 10-year period on public water services and their compliance with various federal state regulations. And their city of Inglewood, 30 million, Laverne, 25 million, Redondo Beach, 29 million, and La Mirada, 9 million. The poorer half of the American households currently bear a disproportionate financial burden paying for public water services. With the new LA County stormwater permit, this disproportionate burden will creep into the middle-class income groups. Mr. Chairman, we need to seriously look at this issue and try to find some common-sense solutions that still protect public health and the environment, but do it in a way that does not necessarily burden our low-income and middle-income residents. And to add, I might want to add that we need to help the cities develop information for their public-private partnerships and be able to find other means of being able to support doing the remedies that are expected of all of us. And we have, of course, in the U.S., some of the best water than other countries. And we need to be able to protect that, but also ensure that disproportionate impact does not hurt those communities that really cannot afford any more unfunded mandates. And with that, I return the balance of my time.
Thank you. Mr. Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'm glad my colleague from California talked about the affordability issue, and that's frankly why we're here. I know it was addressed a little earlier before about the disconnect between what happens here in Washington versus what happens on the ground in the regional offices that regulate states like mine. As a matter of fact, just a few weeks ago in this hearing room, a deputy administrator from the EPA told me he was at a loss when I brought up the fact that they were regulating above-ground septic system discharge units in Illinois when we were talking about the new proposed rule under the Clean Water Act. So it doesn't surprise me when we hear examples that Mr. Meyer talked about of a community that's going to face a burden of upwards from $30 a month to $300 a month just to get water due to the impacts of regulations out here in Washington. And it's affordability. I mean, all Americans, when you look at statistics, the wages for American families have gone down every year since 2007. American families are not living in a healthy economy right now, and they're having to do more with less. And it seems as though, while we're asking American families to do more with less, that agencies like the EPA are asking cities to provide more, regardless of the cost. Now, this affordability issue has got to be addressed because, in the end, the burden falls on the taxpayers, falls on the hardworking families in this country. So, on the affordability issue, and I want to ask each of you to respond, how optimistic are you that the EPA will adjust its affordability guidelines and move away from its enforcement approach to the clean water requirements in order to allow communities like yours, Mr. Mayor, and like yours in Hamilton County to prioritize your requirements based upon the cost versus the environmental impact? And what suggestions do you have to us as a legislative body to make some positive changes in this arena.
I have a couple things to say in that regard. The first would be that we applaud the current discussion. We want to see integrated planning go forward. But in addition, Congress needs to change the Clean Water Act, because the language of the Act has enabled this set of regulatory actions to be fostered in a thoroughly unlimited way. And so, for example, there is language in the Act that says there will be no sanitary sewer overflows. It is absolute, regardless of what the environmental impact is. And I have sanitary sewer overflows in my community.
Most communities do.
No demonstrable public health or environmental impact from spending millions of dollars to eliminate those SSOs. But the agency has no discretion because of the way the Act is written. Furthermore, there is in the law what are called use attainability analyses. And it is the fact that the law requires that the agency is to determine that certain uses can in fact be obtained. But the agency minimizes that, discourages states from using it. The law needs to be changed to make certain that that provision of the Clean Water Act in fact undergirds all the regulatory decisions that are being made, so that we're not spending money on stream. I have an intermittent stream. That term means it dries up in the summer. So when we start looking at all of the range of potential wildlife in the stream, it may not make it, ever, just because it all dries up in the summer. Those kinds of language changes within the law are necessary. So we must have integrated planning. It must work. The regional offices must get the message. But we have to have changes to the Clean Water Act.
Thank you. Mr. Portun?
Congressman, thank you for asking the question, and also Congresswoman Napolitano for raising the issue of affordability, both of you, and bringing our attention around to that. It's critically important. First, in direct answer to your question, we do not believe anything short of an act of Congress is going to compel the EPA to effectively and responsibly address the issue of affordability in a way that provides real relief to those who need it. There is no sense of proportionality or balance with EPA on this issue at all. My general fund budget for everything we do as a county, sheriff, corrections, the courts, coroner, auditor, treasurer, general government services, is $210 million a year. I have to raise in excess of $220 million a year new on top of that just to meet our consent decree obligations under the Clean Water Act. And when we raise those issues, the reaction that we get typically is well, it's the law. You have to do what the law requires. So there's no sense of proportionality in terms of prioritization of what's more important or things of that nature. We need Congress to act. Now, I applaud what the Conference of Mayors is doing and others that want to change provisions in the Clean Water Act. Those things will provide immediate relief. We have avoided proposing that in H.R. 2707 because we thought that would, frankly, result in a long, elongated, contentious legislative process that might not get anything done, and we need help now. We need relief now. So what H.R. 2707 does is, one, it codifies this entire process of integrated planning, flexible approaches, adaptive management practices, and compels annual reporting on that and compliance with that and consistency among the regions and within the regions on that. That will be of direct help. And second, the Showcase Communities program will develop a body of data that all communities can benefit from with respect to an entire new way of addressing these issues that save dollars. The poorest in my community Our poverty-stricken families, households have gone up by 60% in the last 10 years. I've got over 50% of children living in poverty in my community. But those are the very families that will benefit from the $500 million to $1 billion in savings that we will realize from a mandated flexible approach that allows us to prioritize and use new processes, new approaches that will save money. To us, a dollar saved is just as important as a dollar given. And being able to save money is critically important, and we need that help now.
Thank you. If the chairman would allow him to answer any.
Go ahead.
I agree that Congress needs to act. We would like to see that this committee to co-sponsor H.R. 3862. We believe that does bring some responsibility to EPA. We also have ephemeral streams. They only flow 3 to 4 days after it rains, yet they are classified and must be fishable, swimmable. Can you imagine somebody fishing in a gravel bed? And that's what it would amount to. They only flow when it rains. And there are a number of cities that have the experience that I just mentioned to you. There are smaller communities. We see absolutely no way that they can afford these permits, and it has been issued. In fact, the only way that we can see this village can meet their regulations is to close their treatment systems and use the facilities in Unionville 30 miles away.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
I'll be quick. When I go around and talk to young college students and I talk to young adults associated with the history in our nation of clean water, I always emphasize that the Clean Water Act is probably one, if not the most successful statute we've had in place over time to deal with clean water issues. That's, in fact, the case. I just give you Boston Harbor as an example. I use a picture of my son, who's now 32 years old, standing in Boston Harbor when we couldn't get on a boat when he was 3 years old because it was too contaminated to spend a day out in the harbor, and now he's fishing for stripers off the shore in his professional working career when he has time off. I hate to elaborate, but my point is that the EPA has also done a wonderful job over the years. I don't tend to bash them. Without the EPA, we'd be nowhere, respectful of the success stories that we can share here today. I want to plea to you all associated therewith that the mandates we're talking about, the elimination of nutrients, phosphorus, the like in our water bodies, which is existent throughout New England as a matter of course, in a matter of instances. The non-point source program is voluntary. We cannot continue to ratchet down on treatment facilities and utilities to get the job done when we're trying to at this point, well, we just can't go much further with that. With that said, my point is that we need help out of Congress. The age-old way of funding water may not be the way of the future. We can't sustain our needs and the obligation that the federal government has to make, which has assured success in the past, without a recommitment and a reinvigorating new concept, idea, commitment, whatever it takes. The fact of the matter is that the greater good is served by further federal dollars associated with the point of clean water, and without it we can't get the job done. It becomes unaffordable, and the level of commitment and burden that is placed on our citizens is intolerable. So, I mean, that's where I'm coming from.
Thank you. Ms. Etten? Oh, she left. We lost her, huh? Okay.
Because of Davis's filibuster.
Because of Davis's filibuster. Mr. Mullen.
Well, I'll leave it to Rodney to do that. I appreciate it because it sped me up. I thank you for that. Panel, thank you for being here. I tell you, is it Berger? Is that right, Mr. Berger? Just what the chairman said about you driving 10 hours to be here shows your dedication to your town and the importance that that this has on all the communities around the country. This is also something I've dealt with. See, I've been in this business for over 17 years, not politics, but this right here. I'm actually a licensed operator. I operate plants. I've operated plants. And I saw a great shift over the last 7 years where DEQ used to regulate me. and that's where I still receive my licensing from, and I'm sure that's still where you receive your license from, but yet they have zero impact anymore because it's the EPA now that is calling all the shots. My question to the panel, and I'll let you kind of elaborate on this, is where does the role play now with DEQ? I mean, I used to complain about DEQ all the time. It was ODEQ, Oklahoma Department of Environmental Quality, and I've worked in many year-old states with a company we own that's called Mullen Environmental, and we process waste and water. And the compliancy now that the EPA is putting out there, you can't comply with it. Not with the technology that's here, not on the backs of these small communities, yet DEQ had some common sense to them because they lived, worked, and breathed in the same communities. Now that the EPA is coming there, and I've heard this over and over again from the panel, there's no common sense. There's no justification or rhyme or reason, but yet you're having to pay for it. Mr. Meyer, I heard you say that one community, which I represent a very rural community, or all of actually rural communities in Oklahoma on the eastern side. One community, their water bill is going to go from $30 to $300 to comply with the new mandates. Did I hear that right? Go for the record, so the mic.
Correct.
Because of the EPA requirements. Now, has anybody got sick in that community? Has DEQ failed to do their job?
No, sir. Nobody has gotten sick. We see very little impact on the human health due to SSOs. We need to stop them, but let's do it in an affordable manner.
But isn't the EPA's role here is to protect the health and safety of others when it comes to pollution and clean water, what we're drinking, right?
That's correct.
Wasn't that the same role that DEQ was playing inside the state?
We have found that our DNR, and it feels great to be here today. I've got Illinois, I've got Oklahoma, I've got Arkansas.
Well, Oklahoma's better. We all know that. I mean, come on.
But
I mean, look at us. You know which one looks better. So.
But our Department of Natural Resources is centered in Jefferson City. They have delegated the work with us to the region, which is in Springfield, Missouri. We have found that the people on the ground do understand the issues. They do understand the affordability, but they also do have their hands tied.
So, Mr. Burr, inside your community?
We had a long-term control plan actually approved by the state of Ohio.
By DEQ?
By our Ohio EPA, and that was preempted 10 years ago after 5 years of our beginning implementation. And that price tag on that approved plan was $60 million. What we're now negotiating is a consent decree that we've been working on for over 10 years. That price tag is approaching $150 million. And so the state's EPA, Ohio's EPA, was neutered in the process. And we're the ones that had to insist in the last year and a half that they needed to be brought back at the table because we were getting caught between obligations on our NPDES permit versus what the consent decree was now obligating us to. So again, it goes back to the issue of a balance of relationships, a stewardship approach that is now lacking. It's much more a top-down approach from the regional office to us and to the state.
Now, I think it was you, sir, that had mentioned about the fines.
Yes, sir.
Can you elaborate a little bit for just for the record of what these fines are being paid for because of?
My understanding is that the fines are a part of a consent decree process, which is in itself necessary because of our violations of the Clean Water Act.
So, but you haven't had any violations with your state agencies. These are all the from Washington, D.C. They're the ones that are giving you the fines, right?
Correct.
And how much have you spent in your community?
We have, in terms of the, we have spent, we're now in the process of spending another $25 million. We had spent $10 million up to that point.
And just fines?
Not in fines, no.
Okay.
In
and trying to comply?
The fines we have not yet paid, and I'm unwilling to pay them. So,
I support you in that too. You have critical infrastructure needs. You're trying to comply with unfunded mandates, and if they're going to throw it out, then they should be giving the states the financial resources to be able to do it, not put it on the backs of these small communities. But so many of these agencies, they've never even lived in these communities. And yet they don't understand the impact it's going to have. Like Mr. Meyer, you saying one community with 150 people, their water bill is going to go from $30 a month to $300 a month, and most of them won't be able to afford that. Do you want to respond to that?
I just want to say that is absolutely correct. I just want to say that is absolutely correct.
Thank you, panel, for being here, and I went over my time. Chairman, thank you for entertaining my
Mr. Davis from Illinois wanted to rebuttal, but we're not going to let him do it. I want to thank all the witnesses for coming in. This has been very helpful, and it's my intent and commitment that we need to move forward with some legislation to address all your issues, and we'll be working on that. But this hearing today was very helpful to get to that point. So thank you for coming, and have a safe trip back. This concludes the hearing.